Jen, you work with a number of organisations across financial services and other sectors. What does a good risk culture look and feel like?
Well, before we talk about, good risk culture or a culture that's sort of aligned to an organisation's strategy, what I might do is just give a bit of a definition around risk culture, because it's one of those terms I think that people throw around, but quite often I find they don't actually understand what it means in practice. So if we think about an organisation's culture, what we're really talking about are the systems of thinking, feeling, behaving, valuing in an organisation. So things that are really abstract and intangible. Now, the thing that's really important about culture is to realise that it's very inert, it doesn't move very quickly, it's highly stable, so really difficult to change. So when an organisation talks about a whole-scale change of their culture, quite often it makes me laugh, because it is really unlikely that that's going to happen. So when we think about trying to change or tweak an organisation's culture, what we're really talking about is trying to shift a few behaviours in the right direction so that it's more aligned with the strategy and more aligned with the risk appetite. And I think this is really where the definition of risk culture comes in, because it's really about how do we take those systems of thinking, valuing, behaving in an organisation, so the culture, and how do they lead to the right risk managing and risk taking behaviours and outcomes in the business. So when we think about culture change or sort of aligning the organisation to the risk outcomes that they want, really the way we go about doing that is, first of all, figuring out what those critical few behaviours are. So I'm a girl who likes things in threes, so pick 3. No more than 5, it's too complicated. So if you were to pick those critical 3 behaviours at each level of the organisation, so what does it mean at an executive level, what does it mean for middle managers, and what does it mean for frontline, for each of the 3 behaviours? And then taking a look at which levers in the organisation, levers being things like remuneration, performance management, consequence management, the way that we induct people, the way that we train people, so the things that reinforce what's actually important in the organisation. How can we shape those to start to shift those critical behaviours in the right direction? So when we're talking about an organisation, I guess, that has a risk culture that's aligned to its strategy or to its risk appetite, what we're saying is they understand what their culture looks like in practice. They have a high level of understanding of which critical few behaviours are actually important to try and shift in order to get better risk outcomes and better risk management outcomes in the organisation. And they have a high level of understanding of what those levers in the organisation are that are going to shift the behaviours. And they've done some thinking around how it is that they're going to shape those levers in order to deliver on the strategy. So I guess then if we start to think about how does that happen, given that the thing that we're talking about has to do with risk managing and risk taking and getting the right risk outcomes, I really see this having to do with how sophisticated or how embedded the 3 lines of defence is. So if we think about line 2 risk, obviously these are risk experts and they're people that understand all of the theory. In an organisation that is doing a really good job at trying to shift those critical few behaviours in the right direction for risk, what I find is their line 2 not only have, the good theory, but they've got great influencing skills, they're good teachers, and they take a really good partnering approach into the business. So what does that mean? That means that if we're thinking about the training, if we're thinking about induction, if we're thinking about performance management, if we're thinking about consequence management, all of these different levers that we could be using to shift the right behaviours in the business, line 2 risk understands how to translate, all of that great theory from a risk perspective into practice for the HR practitioners or the line 1 leaders or the frontline people that are facing into the customers, to translate it and make it easy for them. When we think about the changes that are made to the levers and how it is that we need to shape those, what an organisation, that's really good at shaping its culture does is they make it easy for people. Because they understand the critical few behaviours that they're trying to get to in the end, they're basically taking all of the noise out of the system. They're lining all of those levers up with what they expect from people, so that people aren't churning a lot of mental energy trying to think about what's the outcome I want to achieve and how should I be delivering it. The system just nudges them in the right direction so they can almost effortlessly get the right risk management outcomes and the right outcomes for the customer.
We often get asked by our clients how they can go about measuring risk culture. Can you give us some insights about how other companies are going about assessing that framework?
I guess we've already spoken about the critical few behaviours and really understanding directionally what's our strategy, what's our risk appetite, what are the types of behaviours that we want to shift at each level of the organisation, and what would that look like in our desired state. So I think that sort of high-level assessment around behavioural outcomes happens at the executive and the board level. And that's really important as a first stage so that you understand the direction that you're going in and making sure that you're aligned to strategy. Then understanding, I guess, what the sort of levers and the climate factors are in the organisation that are going to help you get there with nudging the behaviours. The thing that we find in organisations that do it really well is that they've taken the trouble to develop, I guess, a framework for assessment that's valid and robust and that helps give them an oversight and a level of prediction around which of the levers are going to drive the behaviours that they want. So what this means in practice is that you've figured out how to classify all of the different types of behavioural levers. So are they a communication lever? Are they a performance lever? Are they a leadership lever? And then figuring out, right, what's the best mix of change that you can get in order to drive the behavioural outcomes? And there's a level of sophistication in that to make sure that it's robust and that it's valid, that it's predictive, that it gives you insight, and that it actually tells people which actions would be most appropriate. In organizations that do it very well, that sort of full suite of insight through to action comes out of their assessment methodology. And the assessment methodology could contain a number of things. So everything from surveys, diagnostics, dashboards that use management intelligence data. They might do focus groups, they might do interviews with people, they might do behavioral observations. They could do capability centers, 360-degree reviews. Whatever the suite of data is that they use, the thing that's, I think, most important is that it tells them, so what? So what do you need to do next and how can you continuously improve?
Thanks, Dan. One last question for you, if I may. So APRA have announced their intention to increase the use of behavioural psychologists in observing meetings to assess the risk culture across organisations. Can you give us some learnings from where that's been done elsewhere and perhaps some insights in terms of how organisations should best prepare for this?
Well, I think if we sort of back up and think about what's the intention, I think APRA is probably looking for whether or not the organisation actually understands both the theory of the culture they're trying to drive and why it's appropriate for their strategy and why it's giving the right customer outcomes. I think they're also looking for the practice of, do people live that every day, and do they understand what they as leaders need to do differently as a result of understanding the strategy, understanding the critical few behaviours, understanding the levers that are driving it, and understanding their roles as role models in the organisation. So if we think about any given organisation, I'm assuming that they'd want to look at the level of sophistication of understanding across the organisation and whether this is informative for the board in terms of the types of decisions they're making around the strategy and how risks are managed. What this means in practice is, if I were to go in and take a look at an organisation, do they consistently use the same framework and assessment methodology across all business units? Or do they have a cottage industry of assessment? Do all of the leaders of the business units have the same understanding of what the organization's trying to achieve from a strategic point of view, from a risk management point of view? Do they understand how the culture of the organization and the behaviors of their people drive this? And then if we were to go down and start observing, for example, executive meetings or steering committee meetings or something like that, how does that inform the way that people choose to behave in the moment? So as an example, if we decided that we need to work on transparency or around creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up, how does that play out in the day-to-day behaviours of our leaders when they're actually having, sort of high-impact conversations or conversations that have a consequence for the organisation? So do we see them actually doing in practice what they've said is important on paper when they've done their culture assessment and when they've chosen their critical few behaviours? Those are the types of things that I think the regulator is looking for.